Hello and welcome to Deep Minutes, the channel where we explore the fascinating world of philosophy in bite-sized chunks. Today, we are going to talk about one of the most influential and enigmatic figures in the history of Western thought, Socrates. Socrates was a Greek philosopher who lived in Athens in the 5th century BC. He is widely regarded as the founder of Western philosophy, as well as the first moral philosopher and the first political philosopher. He is also known for his method of questioning, his irony, his paradoxes, and his influence on his students, especially Plato and Xenophon. But what makes Socrates so interesting and relevant for us today? How did he approach the big questions of life, such as what is knowledge, what is virtue, what is happiness, and what is justice, and what would be his advice to live a fulfilled life? To answer these questions, we need to first understand the historical context in which Socrates lived and taught. Socrates was born around 470 BC, during the Golden Age of Athens, when the city-state was flourishing in art, culture, democracy, and military power. He grew up in a relatively poor family and did not receive any formal education. He worked as a stonemason and later served as a soldier in the Peloponnesian War, a long and devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta. Socrates was not interested in the conventional pursuits of wealth, fame, or power. He devoted himself to the pursuit of wisdom, which he defined as the awareness of one's own ignorance. He believed that most people, including himself, lived in a state of relative ignorance, and that the only way to overcome this ignorance was to examine one's own beliefs and opinions critically and rationally. Socrates did not write anything himself, nor did he establish a school or a system of philosophy. He preferred to engage in dialogue with anyone who was willing to listen and learn, whether they were his friends, his students, or his opponents. He would roam the streets and public places of Athens, asking people questions about various topics, such as the nature of justice, courage, friendship, love, piety, and so on. He would challenge their assumptions, expose their contradictions, and reveal their inconsistencies. He would also use irony and humor to make his points, often pretending to be ignorant or confused, while leading his interlocutors to discover the truth for themselves. This style of questioning, known as the Socratic method or elenchus, was not meant to be destructive or negative, but rather constructive and positive. Socrates did not claim to have the answers to the questions he asked, nor did he impose his views on others. He simply wanted to help people think for themselves and to improve their understanding and their character. He believed that by doing so he was fulfilling his divine mission, which he said was given to him by the Oracle of Delphi, the most authoritative source of wisdom in ancient Greece. The oracle had declared that Socrates was the wisest man in the world, because he alone knew that he knew nothing. Socrates took this statement as a paradox and a challenge and decided to test it by examining the wisdom of those who claimed to know something. He found out that most of them were either ignorant or pretentious, and that they did not really know what they were talking about. He concluded that the oracle was right and that the only true wisdom was in knowing one's own ignorance. Socrates also believed that by knowing oneself, one could also know what is good and what is evil and how to act accordingly. He held that virtue, or moral excellence, was the highest good, and that it was based on knowledge, not on external factors such as wealth, power, or pleasure. He argued that no one would knowingly do evil, but only out of ignorance or confusion. He also claimed that virtue was the same for everyone, and that it could be taught and learned through dialogue and education. Socrates was not only a philosopher, but also a teacher and a mentor. He had many followers and admirers who were inspired by his wisdom, his courage, his integrity, and his generosity. Among them were some of the most prominent and influential thinkers of ancient Greece, such as Plato, Xenophon, Antisthenes, Aristippus, Alcibiades, and Critias. They recorded and preserved his words and deeds in their writings, which are the main sources of our knowledge of Socrates today. However, not everyone appreciated Socrates and his philosophy. He also had many enemies and critics who were annoyed, threatened, or offended by his questioning and his criticism. They accused him of corrupting the youth, of undermining the traditional values and beliefs, of disrespecting the gods, and of being a bad citizen. They brought him to trial in 399 BC, when he was 70 years old, and charged him with impiety and subversion. He defended himself eloquently and boldly, refusing to compromise his principles or to beg for mercy. He was found guilty by a narrow margin and sentenced to death by drinking hemlock, a poisonous plant. Socrates accepted his fate with dignity and calmness and spent his last day in prison with his friends and disciples. He discussed with them the topics of death, the soul, and the afterlife, and assured them that he was not afraid to die, but rather hopeful and curious about what would happen next. He drank the hemlock and died peacefully, leaving behind a legacy of wisdom and virtue that has influenced and inspired countless generations of philosophers and seekers of truth. So, what can we learn from Socrates and his philosophy? How can we apply his insights and his methods to our own lives and our own times? And what would be his advice to live a fulfilled life? There are many possible answers to these questions, and no definitive or authoritative ones. Socrates himself would probably encourage us to find our own answers by engaging in dialogue with ourselves and with others, by examining our own beliefs and opinions critically and rationally, by being aware of our own ignorance and limitations, by seeking knowledge and understanding, by striving for virtue and excellence, by being humble and honest, by being courageous and independent, by being generous and compassionate, and by being curious and open-minded. In other words, Socrates would advise us to live a philosophical life, a life of wisdom and love, a life of inquiry and improvement, a life of reflection and action, a life of freedom and responsibility, a life of integrity and authenticity, a life of wonder and joy. This is the end of our video on Socrates and his philosophy. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. If you did, please give us a like, a comment, and a subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. And if you want to learn more about Socrates and other great philosophers, check out our other videos on this channel. Thank you for watching, and remember, the unexamined life is not worth living. See you next time on Deep Minutes,